Hello there, this is Professor D, and we are coming back and we're going to be talking a little bit about the histories and implications of in-group and out-group communication. So looking at the course competencies that we're going to be covering, we're going to be talking about culture and the perception process, national and global environments which necessitate intercultural communication. We're going to be talking about the similarities and differences of verbal and nonverbal communication, beliefs and value systems across cultures. We're going to be looking at stereotyping, discrimination, racism, and then identify strategies to overcome these systemic influences. We're going to identify barriers to intercultural communication, apply strategies to overcome language barriers from a regional, national, global perspective. And we're also going to be talking about a little bit more about where that culture shock idea comes in and what we can do to overcome culture shock when we're looking at cultures that are different than us. Now, I'm going to warn you ahead of time. This is going to be a very hard lecture for you. This is a very hard assignment for you. There's going to be racial slurs. There's going to be representations in this videos that are really difficult to watch, but I think it's important to know because we live in a world where this stuff is real, and we need to live like we live in a world where this stuff is actually real, and we have to deal with the history as well as the ongoing implications of in-group and out-group communication. So with that, let's look at the history of some cartoons and how in-group and out-group communication played out in cartoons historically.
Video for the story of OJ. The first time you see it, the animation is pretty disturbing.
The video is satirizing racist images that have permeated popular cartoons. The characters look like blackface minstrels for a reason. The minstrel shows fundamentally shape its history and language and animation. The white gloves, the huge eyes and mouths, the violent explosions. Our cartoons are chock full of imagery rooted in racist minstrel state. Live minstrel shows began in early 19th century America. White people in blackface makeup pretended to be caricatures of black slaves and freedmen.
How would you like to go to work with me? Yeah, ma'am. How would you gonna pay me, I hope?
By the 1840s, the minstrel show had become America's most popular art form, and lasted into the early 20th century, through the early years of animation.
Amen, brother.
The minstrel shows provided animators with stock characters and themes that would have been very familiar to their audiences. Because of this, many early cartoon characters weren't just like minstrels. They were minstrels, with black bodies and faces with big white ones and eyes. And they aped the classic minstrel show, with big opening musical numbers and slapstick stand-ups of well-known plays and stories. By the 1930s, live minstrel shows were on their way out, and their expression in cartoons became more subconscious. Mickey Mouse had to literally black up to perform a minstrel stand-up of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Long after the classic minstrel show faded from view, its vestiges remained in animation, even today. Take, for example, the white gloves worn by so many cartoon characters. That was an essential part of the minstrel costume, likely taken from the formal wear of slaves. And now, Nintendo portrays the white glove as a god of the cartoon universe, the ironically named Master Hand. And that recurring cartoon explosion where the faces are jarred was a direct reference to blackface makeup. Also, that's a bar of Swanee River playing in the background, the traditional minstrel song. Underlying this explosion gag is another more profound thing, with roots in minstrelsy: repetitive, brutal violence with no consequences. The historical American setting for such violence had been plantations, where masters saw no consequences to mercilessly beating and torturing slaves. This violence became a stylized part of minstrel show slapstick, which made its way into vaudeville and animation, and carried forward through 20th century cartoons. Which brings us back to JC, and those cartoon figures in the story of OJ. The song and the animation remind us that no matter how far the depiction of black people has come, history is very much with us.
So again, when we look at that is a lot to take in, right? And if I'd recommend you watch that video in not sped up time, because it gives you a real sense of the history of cartoons, but then also how that history keeps playing out in right ways, right? Like in the minstrel shows, they did a lot of that violent stuff over and over again, and we still see violence in cartoons today. So when you look at that, I want you to think about and then consider who is affirmed, like what people of what identities did you see affirmed or appreciated, and who was treated as an outside other? So which social identities were made to see as normal or accepted? Which social identities were made to feel different or othered? Do you think this is a problem that is only of the past, or is it still a problem in the future? So with that, we're going to look at how we place people in groups or out groups, and how this process happens to us even subconsciously, because it does keep playing out over and over again.
In-group, out-group. An in-group is a group of people who identify with each other based on a variety of factors, including gender, race, religion, or geography. Our tendency to distinguish between in-group and out-group members has moral implications. People may harm those whom they perceive to be in an out-group in ways they would not harm in-group members. For example, one study showed that when soccer fans viewed fans of their own team being harmed, they felt empathy. But when they viewed fans of a rival team being similarly harmed, they felt pleasure. Likewise, people tend to make different moral judgments based on in-group and out-group distinctions. When someone in our in-group misbehaves, the natural reaction is often to dismiss the behavior as no big deal. But when someone in our out-group does the same thing, we will tend to judge the behavior much more harshly. Indeed, when automatic in-group and out-group distinctions replace conscious and thoughtful reflection, we are more likely to harm one another and behave unethically.
So again, very simple there as far as what's being talked about, right? So, it's interesting, isn't it? Like the idea that if we're a part of a group or part of a team, we get excited or happy when people are hurt. Like that's kind of messed up, isn't it? And I'm not saying like you do it or you're a bad person. I'm talking about what humans do and how humans act. Like when humans see somebody that they feel as though is not part of their group, they feel joy when that person is hurt. So how do you think about this idea or this tendency to think bad behavior is not so bad if it's done by somebody in your group, right? Again, this is the concept of othering. Othering is the degrading of cultures and groups that happen outside of one's own and creates one's own group and then also creates artificial divisions between cultures and groups by labeling language that emphasizes power, relations, and domination over others. So let's look at what is this othering practice? Because again, this gives us a sense of who we include and who we exclude. Who's okay? Who are we okay to spend time with? But who are we like, nah, I don't want to hang out with you so much.
Welcome back to Being the Other. I'm Dr. Dwight Turner. Let's get started. Welcome back to Being the Other. I'm Dr. Dwight Turner. And what we're going to do today, we're going to talk a bit about the notion of othering. We're going to keep this one fairly brief for this week, because I think it's about time we went back and had a look at just what is othering. This is a phrase that's used quite a lot in sociology and psychology, circles, less so perhaps in psychotherapy. Something we probably use a lot more in psychotherapy. But it's a concept that actually helps us to get an idea of just what happens when we stereotype or we objectify somebody, for example. For example, from a sociological perspective, othering occurs when we actually forget or we ignore the humanity, the innate humanity of an individual, and we actually make that person our other. We project onto them aspects of ourselves that we don't want to see. So, for example, if someone to see me as a man of colour, as an angry black man, for example, whilst denying their own anger, they want to recognise who I am within my own inherent humanity, then they'll project that aspect onto myself, irrespective of whether they know me or not. I remember in the very first episode of this series of podcasts, I talked to yourself about an example where I was seen as a bouncer, as opposed to being a psychotherapist. That's a form of stereotyping, a form of othering. It ignores who I am, which is a psychotherapist, a doctor, an academic, and actually projects onto me what the other person, how the other person views men of colour like myself. It's as simple as that, if you like. There is another angle, though, to othering. This is quite important to recognise, that othering can be done to oneself. And this is where, like, a Lacanian perspective is actually very useful in understanding this, because Lacan actually recognised in his studies that what the conscious part of ourselves, what the egoic part of oneself can do, is actually other the unconscious part of ourselves. So we separate ourselves, we form a false self, and then we other that part which then is actually our true self. Lifting outwards happens to other people around us. From a psychotherapist perspective, this is quite important to recognise. Self-othering, the denial of who we actually happen to be, is just as painful and just as problematic as the othering that we receive from others outside of us. In fact, the two can often go hand in hand and can create huge psychological problems if they're left unchecked. This is what othering actually is. It's hugely important to recognise this. Now, the only way that we can actually move beyond othering on a conscious level is by recognising, for example, the person opposite us, say the person in costume serving us coffee is a regular human being and is not just a barista whose name we don't know, who we expect to do a certain job because that's what they're supposed to do. For ourselves, on an internal level, there's something about acknowledging our own cultural, gender, sexual heritage, who we happen to be underneath the surface, and not ignoring that, not othering ourselves in order to fit in with whatever the majority wants of us. Very important. Like I said, it's going to go both ways. So, othering, as I've already stated in other videos, and also I'm going to restate in this one, can be a very painful and psychologically different mental process, but it's one that can be moved beyond if we're willing to actually acknowledge who we are. And if other people are willing to acknowledge who we are as well. And that's one of the problems with the world at the moment. We're not always able to do that. Like I said, this one's going to be a brief video for this month. I'm going to leave this one there. Always a pleasure to see yourself. This is a taster of what othering is all about. If you have any comments, leave them below. If there's anything you want to say or add, send me a message. You're more than welcome to. But as always, it's a pleasure to work with yourselves. I look forward to seeing you again.
So again, othering, right? This is the practice of treating some people as though they belong, they connect, that they're supposed to be a part of you. And then it's also the process of treating people as others, outsiders, different, weird, right? We did a lot of this in grade school. Look at the weird kid, or making fun of the weird kid, or some people were part of our cliques and some people weren't part of our cliques. I think it's hard because if we are not calm, confident people who have a sense of deep value and worth within ourselves, then sometimes what we do is we squash the identity of people that are different than us so we can feel better about who we are. And it's hard because then in that process, we never become the calm, confident person that we need to be that isn't going to be scared of other people. We are constantly in a process of needing to squish people down or make other people feel terrible so we can have a sense of positive self-esteem. And again, we see this happening over and over again, and it happens from a very, very young age. So let's look at this video at Bugs Bunny and times and instances Bugs Bunny engaged in racism. So there we see Bugs Bunny, and we get a sense of how he was making fun of German people, Asian people, black folks. The origins of the One Little, Two Little, Three Little Indian songs comes from killing Native American people, which a lot of people aren't aware of. But again, you can see like Bugs Bunny includes certain people of certain identities, but then others people of other different identities. And we see and hear these messages, and because we see and hear these messages over and over, they start to get embedded. Let's look at Disney and Disney's history of racist cartoons.
Wait, how did we not notice these the first time around? Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 insanely racist moments in Disney movies that you totally forgot about.
Before we begin, we publish new videos every day, so be sure to subscribe for more great content. For this list, we're ranking the most embarrassing, anachronistic, or cringe-worthy moments of racism that Disney would likely want their fans to forget or ignore. We're not passing judgment on the people behind the scenes at Disney here, as many of these moments were a product of their time, but it should also be discussed how many of them haven't exactly aged well. Number 10, Sunflower Fantasia. Fantasia was certainly an early example of a Disney classic, an amazing combination of classical music and animation that still holds up today. What perhaps doesn't hold up so well is a character included on the film's initial theatrical run. Her name was Sunflower, and she was a black female centaur or centaurette who seemed waiting on her white brethren during a segment titled The Pastoral Symphony. Sunflower is drawn with exaggerated black features, and it is a clear example of a visual stereotype that didn't need to be there in the first place. Perhaps this was the reasoning behind Disney's decision to remove the character from print starting in the mid-60s. Number 9. Japanese soldier caricatures. Commando Duck. It may seem strange today to think of cartoons as wartime propaganda, but this was actually a common practice during World War II. Commando Duck was one such short by Disney, a cartoon that sees Donald Duck parachuting into Japanese territory for a secret mission. The short tends to focus its plot primarily on Donald's battle tactics, but there are plenty of racist moments, specifically with how the Japanese enemy is drawn. Donald's foes are deliberately presented with slanted eyes, buck teeth, and overblown accents.
Oh, I beg my pardon. I throw my stomach at you. Very reverent. That's all right. I'll be very welcome to you.
This was certainly due to anti-Japanese sentiments at the time, although it has not aged well when viewing the short today. Number 8. Conveyor Belt Mammy Doll. Santa's Workshop. Santa's Workshop was a holiday-themed Disney short which, on the surface, is a harmless tale of St. Nick and his elves getting ready for Christmas. However, early versions featured a troubling scene between Santa and a pair of dolls, as the toymaker is overseeing quality control on the assembly line. A white doll comes down a conveyor belt, says Mama, and gets approved by Santa. Then a black doll tumbles down the belt, says Mommy, and stamps her own butt, and Santa watches on and laughs. Given that the word mammy was slang for a black nursemaid in the time of slavery, and the doll's exaggerated features, it's no wonder Disney removed this scene from all modern prints. Number 7. King Louie, The Jungle Book. King Louie is a beloved character from Disney's adaptation of Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book.
Oh, King Louie. That's me.
Louie is a Disney original, having not appeared in Kipling's original stories, but he didn't arrive without his fair share of controversy.
King Louie and his 8 subjects are the only characters that speak in jive slang, popular with black jazz musicians of the day. Richard M. Sherman was one of the songwriters on the film, and has been quoted as initially wanting jazz legend Louis Armstrong to voice the king, but balked at the prospect of potentially offending the NAACP with a black man voicing an ape. So, is King Louie racist, or is it all in the eye of the beholder? You decide. Number 6, Arabian Nights, Aladdin. The American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee wasn't too thrilled with the soundtrack for Disney's 1992 hit Aladdin. They took specific umbrage with a line in the film's opening song, Arabian Nights, where the peddler sings, "Where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face." The committee saw this as disparaging towards the Arab people, and complained to Disney for a lyrical change. The company did comply, and replaced the line for home video, and on new version of the soundtrack. The committee was also reportedly upset about another controversial line from the song. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. But Disney decided to leave this one in, for better or worse.
If I was rich as you, I could afford some manners. Oh.
Number 5. Native American stereotypes. Peter Pan. Intent can be a funny thing, especially when it's perceived much differently years later. Disney's Peter Pan is an example of this notion, as evidenced by a shockingly racist musical number with very innocent intentions. The Native American sequence in the film raises flags with the song "What Made the Red Man Red," where embarrassing Indian stereotypes are the order of the day. Although the scene is light and bouncy in tone, the effect years later is rather cringeworthy in its execution, a blemish on what's otherwise a classic slice of Disney nostalgia. Number 4. We Are Siamese, If You Please. Lady and the Tramp. The intentions behind Peter Pan's racism may be up for debate, but it's a lot more difficult to defend the outrageous cultural insensitivity behind the Siamese cast in Disney's Lady and the Tramp. Post-World War II tensions are the only probable reasons behind the obvious Japanese stereotypes of Sai and M, 2 villainous cats who sing the song. The twins are drawn with the same slanted eyes and buck teeth we saw earlier in Commando Duck, and their entrance is even marked by a gong, something that hampered Asian stereotypes in film right through the 80s and 90s. Number 3. Shunban and the Alley Cats, the Aristocats. We continue with Asian stereotypes here, proof that negative depiction of such characters wasn't only limited to the immediate aftermath of World War II. Nope, Asians were still being drawn with the same old slanted eyes and outrageous accents in 1970, as evidenced by Shunban and the gang in the Aristocats. Shunban rolls with Thomas O'Malley's Alley Cat friends, and performs his part of the song Everybody Wants to Be a Cat, with chopsticks and a buck-toothed lisp. He isn't the only feline stereotype here, however, as there's also Peppo, an amorous Italian, and the trumpet-playing scat cat who's modeled after black jazz musicians of the 50s and 60s. Number 2. The Crow's Dumbo. The term Jim Crow was used to describe laws or regulations designed to enforce racial segregation in the United States. The lead crow in Disney's Dumbo is also named Jim, and has received his share of criticism in the decades since the film's release in 1941. Although Jim and the other crows are generally friendly towards Dumbo, the fact that they speak in stereotypical black slang could easily be interpreted as lazy or racist in their depiction of African American culture. The gang does get to sing the film's most memorable song, When I See an Elephant Fly, but this doesn't change the fact that modern audiences might see the crows in a very different light. Before we unveil our number 1 pick, here are some honorable, or in this case, dishonorable mentions.
You be my man fight. Fight, you fight, me. I'm the Full Brush Man. I would be way too golly.
Number 1. Uncle Remus, Song of the South. Uncle Remus wasn't a Disney creation, but his depiction in this 1946 film lives on as one of the company's most infamous moments. Remus was a fictional character responsible for narrating classic African-American folktales. When he hit the silver screen, however, Remus and Song of the South almost immediately struck a sour note with audiences. For starters, the film never explicitly presents itself as taking place in a post-Civil War South, leading many to believe that Disney was marginalizing the impact of slavery. There were also a plethora of black stereotypes to be found, which eventually resulted in the film failing to receive an uncut home video release in the United States to this day.
Do you agree with our picks? Check out these other great clips.
So there it is, right? Again, looking at the history of cartoons. Now, when we're looking at cartoons, who is the good guy? Who was seen as the villain over and over again? What do you think it felt like if you were Native American, Asian American, African American to watch these cartoons? What do you think it did to shape the way they saw or understood themselves? Or is this idea like just history? With that, we're going to explore this concept of blackface. So every Halloween, the idea of blackface comes up, but a lot of people don't know about the history of it, where it comes from, and why it's done in the way that it's done. So we're going to watch this video about blackface and then kind of talk a little bit more about in-grouping and out-grouping.
As you may have heard, NBC Today host Megyn Kelly's show was canceled this past week following her on-air remarks expressing acceptance of blackface. It's a racist show business practice most of us thought was long gone, but as Maurice Dubois is about to tell us, blackface has a long history in our country, and we caution you his report unavoidably includes many offensive and disturbing images.
It happens all too frequently, often at Halloween, but not exclusively.
They thought it was a joke, but it really just was not funny at all.
For example, 2 years ago in Maplewood, New Jersey.
Her daughter posted this photo of herself and a friend in blackface. The two girls had no idea what blackface was or the history of it.
The history of blackface is long and complex and deeply ingrained in our culture.
Who was that lady I saw you with this afternoon? That was no lady. That was my wife.
Even Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd blacked out. For more than 100 years, white and then black performers wore dark makeup and created not only a popular theatrical form, but stereotypes that are still with us today. This makes you uncomfortable, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It does make me feel uncomfortable to talk about these things because they are incredibly disturbing and revolting.
Eric Lott, a professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, says blackface represents a strange mix of envy, fascination, desire, and fear. Explain the fear part to me. What are these white performers or these white people afraid of?
They're afraid of black groups, mobs, rising up and taking the power.
Minstrel shows began in the 1830s, and white performers used burnt cork or layered black grease paint. Minstrelsy eventually became the most popular form of entertainment in the country.
Ah, yes.
I asked Margot Jefferson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning critic, to look at some images from the New York Public Library.
The shininess of the black against the big white clown's mouth, the hat, the overlong tail coat, mocking. It always gives me the jolt that racist history does. Blackface is so tied to comedy, to people enjoying themselves, to people having fun, that rattles you still more.
Well, Sample, you seem to be enjoying yourself, isn't it? Enjoying myself. I sure is.
White minstrel performers claimed that what they did on stage was based on their perceptions of how black people lived.
Some of this came out of a genuine fascination with the music, the songs, the dances, the performance styles of black people.
But it's also where Jump Jim Crow was born, along with other characters depicted as lazy, lying, or buffoonish. Remember, this was all happening before the Civil War.
Slavery was all about creating visions, types, stereotypes of an entire race of people as subhuman in every way.
By the 1860s, African Americans began using blackface on stage. Why on earth would a black performer put on blackface and demean him or herself?
This is the 19th century. They had limited options. They were expected to.
Why?
Because it made the audiences comfortable. You can be fascinated, you can be excited, but you can always feel superior.
In effect, the black makeup on a black performer became a theatrical mask with many layers of meaning. Professor Eric Lott.
The mask, I think, says to white audiences, you have nothing to fear. Go ahead, enjoy yourself. To black audiences, I think any number of things might have been communicated. Like, can you believe that these people are making me put on this mask? So they will be entertained. In other words, there's a kind of linking to the black audience. But it gave black performers access to the stage.
One of the biggest black stars to come out of the minstrel tradition was Burt Williams, who wore blackface from vaudeville to Broadway.
It's clear that he was a genius of a performer.
But how did he reconcile performing in this demeaning art form?
He was very melancholy about it. He knew it was necessary for his career, as all other black performers knew it.
Minstrelsy on stage basically died out in the 1920s, but blackface lived on in the movies. In 1927, Al Jolson starred in the pioneering talking picture The Jazz Singer, playing a young man who prefers singing popular music rather than his family's traditional Hebrew prayers.
I don't
want to look at what did they actually do there?
I totally understand.
Wait a minute. I don't like the way he said that.
In the Our Gang comedies of the 1930s, Spanky appeared in blackface.
Ugly. Did you say Spanky was in a lot of trouble? Yes, sir.
The gag here is that the gang doesn't realize that that's Spanky in blackface until they actually see Buckwheat.
Hiya, Buckwheat. Hiya, Buckwheat.
So the gist of it is that you put blackface makeup on anyone and they become black.
And that's supposed to be hilarious.
And it's supposed to be really funny.
When he grows up.
And it goes on. During the golden age of the Hollywood musical, Judy Garland.
When he walks down the street, from centuries to meet Mr. Franklin D. Roosevelt John.
Bing Crosby.
That's why we celebrate Blessed February Day, Abraham.
Fred Astaire, and many others, all blacked up. It's still in the culture.
It is too easy, I think, simply to dismiss the history of blackface as that racist stuff. And most of us are better than that. I don't think most of us are better than that. We are that. That's what we are.
Some people say in order to move forward, we need to put this stuff behind us, as painful, as just upsetting that it may be.
Any form of history that gets suppressed or repressed or erased out, it comes back to haunt. What has to happen now is a discussion, an acknowledgement of this charged, complicated, painful history.
So again, as we look at that, we start to see how even though we feel like this stuff is in the past, for some reason it keeps coming back up. It keeps resurfacing over and over again. So how did you feel about this idea of blackface when you first saw it or heard about it? Is this the first time you heard about it, or have you heard about it before? How do you feel about it now, looking at the video? Do you think it's just innocent, just fun, or do you think it actually creates a sense of othering that does diminish some people? Like, questions to think about as you start to move forward looking at the assignment related for this activity. And again, if you think all of that's in the past, let's start looking at what modern day depictions do to create a sense of othering and who's in group and who's out group.
Wait, I think that's accident here.
I'm just not that kind of girl. I miss this one's on the first date.
So anyway, my social security will expire until December. Yeah, well, anyway.
Oh, please, all we ever do is call me names and rip on me for being Jewish. Kyle, when have I ever been on you for being a Jew?
Nothing I hate worse than a Jew who doesn't appreciate her own rich heritage. Come on, boy, let's get her.
Where's your smoothie, sweetheart?
Why would I suck smoothie when I can suck face with you, Mrs. Archie? I'm Professor Annalise Keating, and this is Criminal Law 100, or as I prefer to call it,
How to get away with murder.
I'm stressed, and the last thing you should be doing is telling me how stressed I am.
you see those divergences? Thank you. Everybody on that show can do it.
If I could go back in the machine, I would. But I can't. All I can tell you is that I'm a different person now.
You should race.
Well, I love this idea. I just thought I have to do it. I can hear anything you're saying.
Oh, God, that looks so good.
I get 18 years of my life to stand in the same spot as you. Don't you think I ever wanted other things?
I'm going to Berkeley to give my lecture.
Oh, you are? When you coming back?
Tomorrow night. Now, while I'm gone, I want you to do everything your uncle says.
Save your life.
They're down the streets together, though.
So again, these ideas are called tropes. They're things that we tend to see over and over again. So some of the tropes that you saw there are the idea of Asian women as submissive or exotic. There's a magical Negro trope, which is the idea of an older black man who comes to mentor a white person into becoming skillful at some magical process. You'll see the angry black woman trope, the angry black man trope. Again, you see these images over and over and over again. And because it validates some people and it invalidates others, it creates a sense of patterning in our head that makes it hard to divorce from what we think and see to how we maybe even begin to treat others. So I want you to think, who writes, who directs, who produces most, not like who does every now and again, for the most part, who writes, directs, and produces most TV shows? Why do you think there are fewer flat or stereotypical examples of white people or men considering who writes and directs and produces most TV shows? How do you think young people of all races are affected by the things they see on TV and media shows? How are you affected in that you see these things over and over again? Right? Think about this thing. What is what we see over and over again do to us? And how does it begin to subtly affect how we communicate with others. This is a little bit more on how in-groups and out-groups can play out.
And this was part of the research of the great social psychologist Henri Tajfel. Tajfel was born in Poland in 1919. He had to go to university in France because as a Jew, he couldn't go to university in Poland. And then he enlisted in the French military in World War II. He was captured and ended up in a prisoner of war camp. And it was a terrifying time for him because it was discovered he was a Jew. He could have been moved to a concentration camp where he most likely would not have survived. And in fact, when the war ended and he was released, most of his friends and family were dead. He got involved in different pursuits. He helped out the war orphans, but he had a long-lasting interest in the sort of science of prejudice. And so when a prestigious British scholarship on stereotypes opened up, he applied for it and he won it. And then he began this amazing career. And what started his career is the insight that the way most people were thinking about the Holocaust was wrong. Many people, most people at the time, viewed the Holocaust as sort of representing some tragic flaw on the part of the Germans, some genetic taint, some authoritarian personality. And Tajfel rejected this. Tajfel said, what we see in the Holocaust is just an exaggeration of normal psychological processes that exist in every one of us. And to explore this, he did a series of classic studies with British adolescents. And in one of his studies, what he did was he asked British adolescents all sorts of questions. And then based on their answers, he said, I've looked at your answers, and based on the answers, I have determined that you are either, he told half of them, a Kandinsky lover, you love the work of Kandinsky, or a Klee lover, you love the work of Klee. It was entirely bogus. Their answer had nothing to do with Kandinsky or Klee. They didn't even heard of the artists. He just arbitrarily divided them up. But what he found was these categories mattered. So when he later gave the subjects money, they would prefer to give the money to members of their own group than members of other group. Worse, they were actually most interested in establishing a difference between their group and other groups. So they would give up money for their own group if by doing so they could give the other group even less. This bias seems to show up very early. So my colleague and wife Karen Wynn at Yale has done a series of studies with babies where she exposes babies to puppets. And the puppets have certain food preferences. So one of the puppets might like green beans. The other puppet might like graham crackers. They test the baby's own food preferences. Babies typically prefer the graham crackers. But the question is, does this matter to babies and how they treat the puppets? And it matters a lot. They tend to prefer the puppet who has the same food taste that they have. And worse, they actually prefer puppets who punish the puppet with a different food taste. We see this sort of in-group, out-group psychology all the time. We see it in political clashes within groups with different ideologies. We see it in its extreme in cases of war, where the out-group isn't merely sort of given less, but dehumanized, as in the Nazi perspective of Jews as vermin or lice, or the American perspective of Japanese as rats.
So again, right, we start to see these things play out. So this is where things can go when we start thinking about in-group and out-group. So think about you and look at yourself really critically, right? Like, don't think, oh, I'm a good person, I never make mistakes. Like, really look at yourself. Do you think it's possible that you out-group others? Are there some people that, like, you don't want to talk to, you don't want to connect with? Maybe it's Democrats, maybe it's Republicans. It could be people of, like, certain wealth or race background, right? Like, who do you connect to? Do you think it's easier to in-group people due to your association with them? Do you feel like it's easier to connect with, justify, validate somebody because you're in the part of the same group? With whom do you choose to interact with and who do you exclude, right? An example of people that we exclude, and we do it with our physical movement, is when people are on the side of the road and they're asking for money. What do? We look away. Why do we look away? So we don't have to connect with them as a human being. Right? If we looked at them and deeply connected with them as a human being, maybe we're afraid of what could potentially happen. One of the best things I've ever heard is, if we really saw a homeless person, I think our fear is that we would potentially have them on our couch rather than avoid them. And does it matter how people are treated? So again, let's watch a little bit more on in-groups and out-groups and how that stuff can manifest. Let me look at this video before I decide to play it because I think it's kind of longer. Yes, it's quite a bit longer, so I'm not going to go to it. But again, this video is excellent. It's The Eye of the Storm from Jane Elliott from 1960. It's embedded in the slides. It's got a little girl's picture in the front of it, but it shows you just how basically favoring people a little bit and disfavoring other people a little bit, we can start making people act like they hate each other. It's amazing. And it's done with kids, with little kids who shouldn't be like racially biased or stereotypically biased in the same way as you'd think adults would be. So recognizing and extending that, understanding that is really important. So this video is about how we see in-groups and out-groups in society and how that
In February
manifests.
1999, 4 New York City police officers were on patrol in the Bronx when they saw a young black man standing on a stoop. They thought he looked suspicious. When they pulled over, he retreated into the doorway and began digging in his pocket. He kept digging as the police shouted at him to show his hands. A few seconds later, the man Amadou Diallo, a 23-year-old fingerprint from Guinea, was dead, hit by 19 of the 41 bullets that the police fired at. What Diallo was reaching for was his wallet. He was going for his ID as he stood on the steps of his own apartment building. Diallo's story and the officer's fatal prejudgment of him is recounted in Malcolm Gladwell's 2005 bestseller, Blink. Gladwell, and the social psychologist whose work he draws upon, explores Diallo's case as an example of that gray area between deliberate violence and accident, propagated by non-conscious or implicit biases. The officers did discriminate against Diallo, but the prejudice they acted on may have been driven by something more subtle than simple hatred. And that's an important thing to think about. Yes, there are lots of overtly bigoted people and policies that work all over the world, but what we're interested in today is the more insidious, non-conscious, automatic bias and how it can affect our behavior. The fact is, our implicit biases affect the way we relate to others in a very real way. Our race, gender, age, religion, or sexual orientation can make the difference between whether we get a job or not, a fair paycheck or a good rental, or whether we get randomly pulled over or shot and killed for reaching for a wallet. So in the last 2 episodes, we examined how we think about and how we influence one another. But social psychology is also about how we relate to one another. Like what factors might cause us to help another person or harm them or fear them. What are the social and cognitive and emotional roots of prejudice, racism, and sexism, and how do they shape our society? These are some of the aspects of ourselves that are the hardest and most uncomfortable for us to explore, which is why they're so important to understand. We've all been unfairly judged in our time, and let's not pretend that we haven't done our fair share of uninformed judging too. Like it or not, prejudice is a common human condition. Prejudice just means prejudgment. It's an unjustified, typically negative attitude toward an individual or group. Prejudicial attitudes are often directed along the lines of gender, ethnic, socioeconomic status, or culture. By definition, prejudice is not the same thing as stereotyping or discrimination, although the three phenomena are intimately related. People may distrust a female mechanic. That's a prejudicial attitude, but it's rooted in a stereotype or overgeneralized belief about a particular group. Although it's often discussed in a negative way, stereotyping is really more of a general cognitive process that doesn't have to be negative. It can even be accurate at times. Like I have the stereotype that all crows have wings, injuries and birth defects aside, and that happens to be true. But on the negative end, your prejudice against female mechanics may be rooted in some inaccurate stereotype about women's skills with a socket wrench. And when stereotypical beliefs combined with prejudicial attitudes and emotions like fear and hostility, they can drive the behavior we call discrimination. So a prejudiced person won't necessarily act on their attitude. Say you believe in the stereotype that overweight people are lazy. You might then feel a prejudiced distaste when you see someone who appears overweight. So if you act on your prejudice and say refuse to hire them for a job or don't let them sit at your lunch counter, then you've crossed over into discriminating against them. The former apartheid system of racial segregation in South Africa, the Nazis' mass killing of gypsies, Jewish people, and other groups, and centuries of bloodshed between Protestants and Catholics are all extreme examples of violent prejudice and discrimination. The good news is that in many cultures, certain forms of overt prejudice have waned over time. For example, in 1937, only 1/3 of Americans said they'd vote for a qualified woman to be president, while in 2007, that figure was up to nearly 90%. So of course, more subtle prejudices can still linger. And we talk about dual process theories of thought, memory, and attitudes, and that while we're aware of our explicit thoughts, our implicit cognition still operates under the radar, leaving us clueless about its effect on our attitudes and behavior. In the same way, prejudice can be non-conscious and automatic. And I mean, it can be so non-conscious that even when people ask us point blank about our attitudes, we unwillingly or unknowingly don't always give them an honest answer. Do you think that men are better at science than women, or that Muslims are more violent than Christians, or that overweight people are unhealthy? Our tendency to unwittingly doctor our answers to questions like these is why we have the implicit association test, or IAT. The test was implemented in the late 1990s to try to gauge the implicit attitudes, identities, beliefs, and biases that people are unwilling or unable to report. You can take the IAT online and measure your implicit attitudes in all kinds of topics, from race, religion, and gender to disability, weight, and sexuality. It's basically a time categorization task. For example, the age-related IAT looks at implicit attitudes about older versus younger people. In it, you might be shown a series of faces, old and young, and objects, pleasant and unpleasant, like pretty flowers versus a pile of garbage. You're then asked to sort these pictures. So you press the left key if you see a young face or a pleasant object, and press the right key if you see an old face or an unpleasant object. That's the stereotypic condition. Your keystrokes correspond to stereotypical pairs, in this case associating good stuff with youth and bad stuff with older age. Then the test asks you to do the same thing in a counter-stereotypic condition, pressing the left key if you see a young face or an unpleasant object, and the right key if you see an old face or a pleasant object. The core of the test is your reaction time. Are you faster at sorting when you're working with a stereotypical pairing than you are with counter-stereotypical pairings? If that's the case, even though you may think you're unprejudiced, you've got an implicit association between youth and goodness, which, as you might guess, may have some implications about how you think and act toward older people. The test is widely used in research, and contrary to what some critics think, it's surprisingly predictive of discriminatory behavior in all kinds of experimental settings. So that's one way to measure subtle implicit prejudice, but obviously overt prejudice is far from dead. And that's why discrimination studies are prominent in social psychology research, and they can also predict, sometimes with scary accuracy, how discrimination might show up in broad social patterns, like wage inequality and job opportunity gaps. For instance, a 2012 study led by Yale social psychologist Corinne Moss-Rakusin demonstrated that science faculty across the country systematically discriminated against female science students. In a double-blind study, a representative sample of science faculty members were asked to hire a fictional student applicant for a lab manager job. When the applicant's name was Jennifer instead of John, they viewed her as less competent, were less likely to hire her, offered her less money, and were less likely to mentor her. And this prejudice was even exhibited by women faculty members. And that's an important point. People on both sides of the stereotype tend to respond similarly, with the subjects of prejudice themselves often holding the same stereotypical implicit attitudes or engaging in the same discriminatory behavior. So when we say that stereotypes are pervasive, we mean pervasive. Now, it's all too easy to hold up examples of how people are prejudiced, but the real root of the issue is why they are. Here are a few possibilities. For one, prejudices can come up as a way of justifying social inequalities. This happens when people on both sides of the power and wealth spectrum start believing that people get what they deserve, and they deserve what they get. This is called the just world phenomenon. Prejudices can also be driven by the us versus them, or as social psychologists often call it, the in-group, out-group phenomenon. Whether you're in a soccer stadium or the political arena or school lunchroom, or in the comments of this video, dividing the world into in-groups and out-groups definitely drives prejudice and discrimination. But an in-group identity also gives its members the benefits of communal solidarity and a sort of safety in numbers. This in-group bias, or tendency to favor your own group at the expense of others, is powerful even when it's totally irrational. One common social psychology exercise on in-group favoritism involves dividing a class into two arbitrary groups, say those wearing sneakers. sneakers and those not wearing sneakers. Each person sits with his or her group and is told to list the differences between themselves and the opposing group. The lists usually start out pretty tame, but become more strident as they grow longer. Eventually, you have sneaker-wearing kids saying that they're just smarter than the people without sneakers, or kids who don't have sneakers say that the others are trashy and low class. Soon enough, each group has inflated itself and derided the opposing group, even though the division between the two was essentially meaningless to begin with. Little exercises like this illustrate the power of any in-group out-group distinction in creating conflict between groups, and that brings us to the psychological nature of conflict itself. History is littered with examples of how the us versus them mentality has fueled violence and warfare, which is exactly what we'll be talking about next time. Today, we learn about how prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination affect how we interact.
So again, right, that gives us a sense about how this in-group, out-group stuff works. And this is not one of those things where I'm just looking to damn or disparage people of favored social identities. So, like men, white people, people in higher socioeconomic classes. The problem is this affects us, and it really keeps us apart as people. And it really keeps us from connecting as people. And we start picking up on these messages at a really, really young age. And it causes us to love or hate ourselves based on what we see. So I'm going to show you the last video in this series called A Girl Like Me that talks about the issues that young black women deal with based on media representation and things they see in society about how they're supposed to think or feel about themselves.
Every black female has a big butt and big boobs. Loud, obnoxious. Yellow. Light skin being more attractive than dark skin.
We're not smart. We're in a certain that way. And a lot of times we have to prove ourselves as not being true.
At a young age, I already knew the standards for a girl like me. As I become older, they become more obvious.
You have to have permed hair, relaxed hair, you know, straight hair or like blonde hair, you know, long waves or something. And if it's natural, that's good hair. Like black hair is hair you have to relax because it's kinky. Like it's not like a pale and a half, like natural hairstyles. Or like if they are natural, they have to be like the curly head, like black girl. That's something that looks mixed or something. I remember when I first started wearing my hair natural, at first my mom was okay with it. And she thought it was nice. And then after like the second day, she was like, oh, stop that. She was like starting to look African. I was like, well, I am African. And that really pissed me off.
There are standards that aren't imposed upon us, like, you know, you're prettier if you're light skinned.
I knew people in the past that like just like wanted to be light skinned, not for any particular reason, you know, but they love themselves. I mean, they love themselves except for, you know, the color of their skin.
Like my siblings are all lighter than me, and my mom, she's dark skinned, but she's lighter than me. So like I noticed, and I was like, hey, how come I'm the darkest, and you know everybody else is so light? And I don't know. Since I was younger, I also considered being lighter as a form of beauty, or you know, beautiful, more beautiful than being dark skinned. So I used to think of myself as being ugly because I was dark skinned.
I knew people who actually like went out there and got, you know, bleaching cream and everything. They actually like laid in the tub, like poured like capfuls of bleach into it just so they could like see if their skin would get lighter. Yeah, my aunt that lives in Honduras, she basically started using skin bleaching cream when she was about 25, and she started her oldest daughter on it when she was about 11, and then she has an even younger daughter that was about 6 when she started using the skin bleaching cream on her.
I've seen people say that I would never marry a dark skinned man because I don't want that in my gene pool.
On the other hand, like some girls have their issues too. We would call high yellow, cunt and house nigga. I feel like both sides have their issues.
I guess I sort of felt like there was not any attention towards me because of maybe my skin color or because my hair was kinky or you know just this and that. Or even when I was younger, like say there was I don't know, a doll. I used to have a lot of dolls, but most of them were just white dolls with long straight hair that I would comb, and I would be like, oh, I wish I was just like this Barbie doll. In Brown versus Board of Education, the famous case that desegregated schools in the 1950s, Dr. Kenneth Clark conducted a doll test with black children. He asked them to choose between a black doll and a white doll. In most instances, the majority of the children preferred the white doll. I decided to reconduct this test as Dr. Clark to see how we've progressed since then. Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you like to play with? That one?
I like to play with this.
And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll?
He's white.
And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And why does that look bad?
Because it's black.
And why do you think that's a nice doll?
Because she's white.
And can you give me the doll that looks like you? 15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll.
Our ancestors came to this country and they were pretty much ripped out of their culture. You know, they couldn't speak their language. They couldn't be themselves. They had to be like what everybody else told them to be. When you don't know where you're from, and you don't know what country you're from, all you know is basically you're from Africa, that's all you're given.
I feel like it brings on like a lot of ignorance, and it builds a lot of anger. I've seen it build a lot of anger in a lot of Black young females. Like, I don't know, they feel like because they feel like they have a right to disown any kind of, you know, African roots.
I think for a Black girl in general, it's like you're missing a piece of you, you know. And for me, yeah, it's like, oh, I don't have any actual heritage, not heritage, but culture. Like, I know I'm from Africa, but you know, the different countries in Africa have their different cultures, their different morals, their different values, and not knowing that it sort of keeps us at a loss. And I feel like we're busy searching for it while everybody else in society is throwing their ideas and what they believe we should be at us. But you know, personally, we know that's not what we should be, but we're gonna take it because we don't know exactly what it is that we should be, because we don't really know where we came from.
So again, right, the costs of this stuff are really heavy. And when you think about the little kids, right? When the little kid pushes the doll forward, which is the bad doll, which is the doll that looks like me, do you think their parents taught them they were bad? How do you feel like they learned about who's good, who's bad? Did you, like me, did your heart break when the girl at the end pushed that doll forward? It's hard because, again, this is the world we live in. And so think about you and critically look at yourself. Who do you choose to outgroup? How do you choose them, and why do you choose them? And if it was easier to make the list with people that were like you, then why was it so hard to think about what the world would look like from people outside your perspective? Part of the reason we have this issue is because over and over again, we keep defaulting to the same type of people, the same type of thinking, the same type of movies, the same type of TV shows. And it really inhibits who we are as people, because over and over again, we get the message, some people connect and belong and should be with us. And over again, we get the message, some people are different, some people are weird, some people deserve their situations, right? And this becomes a huge barrier with intercultural communication. So with that, that's all I have for you. Thank you for your time and attention with this podcast and video. I hope you learned something about it, and I can't wait to see you express what you learned or found out in the 10 people closest to you, as well as more about this in your reflection journals. With that, peace and blessings, and I can't wait to talk to you again next time.